Hello, again, this is Dr. Lindsay. In this video, we're going to be going over stabilization policies and how they work in terms of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Okay, so if we take a look at the business cycle, we know that GDP goes up and down over time. Not a whole lot, just usually a little tiny bit. Just, 0.5% or so for a couple of quarters is enough to be termed a recession. So on the vertical axis here, we're going to put real GDP. And we'll look at that over time. And so we've got this cycle that goes up and down and presumably up. There's a drift up over time. And what we want to do with some sort of stabilization policy is even this out somewhat. So we don't have these ups and downs about the economy. We don't have any drastic recessions or recessions. People don't mind the boom times so much. We just don't like the down times. In terms of these ups and downs, we can think of them as shocks to the economy. Positive shocks or negative shocks that cause the economy to go up and down have this business cycle, called a business cycle, but it's actually probably more of a consumer cycle than a business cycle. Now, in terms of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, we'll put inflation here on the vertical axis and real GDP on the horizontal axis. And we've got this aggregate supply curve and a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. This will be the short run aggregate supply curve. And we have some equilibrium at some level of output and some level of inflation. And these aggregate demand curves and aggregate supply curves are moving all the time, changing the equilibrium. So we can look at this downturn in the economy as part of this business cycle is, hey, there's a sudden drop in aggregate demand. And the result is output drops. And remember, this aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net exports. Most likely a downturn in the economy is because of aggregate demand. Most all the recessions in the past have been because of drops in aggregate demand, not so much by changes in aggregate supply. So something in that C plus I plus G changes and changes aggregate demand curve to cause that to shift. Eventually, we'll get back to full employment and potential output, but we don't know exactly how long that's going to take. It could take quite a long time without some sort of interference, really, by our government to try to stabilize this downturn, or we can think of it as trying to stabilize aggregate demand. Now, the nice thing about this model, and there's lots of macroeconomic models, besides just being the one that's most used and the easiest to understand, it does seem to explain a lot of things. It does seem to explain the data during the 1930s depression in the US. And during the depression in the US, by the way, there really was no stabilization policies by the government. This came later. Remember, Keynes didn't even publish his book until the middle of the depression of the 30s. Economists didn't start making these aggregate demand, aggregate supply charts until the 40s. So there really was no intentional stabilization policy during the depression. It was more like, don't do anything, the economy will get out of it by itself. So how long does it take for the economy to get out of this a recession by itself and back to full employment? Because we know we will be there eventually in the future. Well, how long did it take during the depression? We don't have that many data points to look at here, but that one shows it took a good 10 years or 15 years to get out of it. So it potentially could be decades before the economy gets back to normal full employment and full output all by itself. People usually don't want it to take that long. So, two types of policies in general that we have: fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy involves spending and taxes. So it's government spending, which we symbolize with a big capital G, or changing taxes, government taxes, which we symbolize with a T. So changing either one of those will change aggregate demand. G directly, taxes indirectly, because it changes the amount that people have left over after their taxes to spend. So increasing taxes means that people have less money to spend, and so consumption will fall if taxes go up. Fiscal policy is done by Congress and the president. Congress makes the laws, and the president signs them or vetoes them. The second type of monetary policy, or stabilization policy, that we'll go over in another module is monetary policy. And this involves changing the money supply. And I'll just write MS for the money supply, because it's well known by economists that if you change the money supply, it also affects GDP. Increasing the money supply stimulates the economy. And contractions of the money supply contract the economy. And for the most part, that's what caused the Depression in the 1930s, was a big contraction of the money supply. The Federal Reserve that controls the money supply wasn't really aware of it at that time as to what was going on. They were actually responsible for turning a garden variety recession into a depression. And when Ben Bernanke, head of the Federal Reserve, who studied the Depression, when he finally became chair of the Federal Reserve, he apologized on behalf of the Federal Reserve for turning what would have been a short recession into a depression in the 1930s. So monetary policy is controlled or handled by the Federal Reserve, because they have the power to print money. Congress and the president do not determine the money supply. And the Federal Reserve does not tax people or spend the money. So two completely different organizations of our government to stabilize the economy. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they work against each other. Now, the pre-Keynesian thinking before the 1930s about stabilization policy was it wouldn't do any good. Even if you tried to stabilize the economy somehow by fiscal policy or monetary policy, it wouldn't work. The thinking about monetary policy before Keynes was, if you increase the money supply, it'll just increase prices. We'll have some more inflation. If you decrease it, we'll have some deflation. But they didn't believe that it would stimulate or affect the economy with real GDP at all, or unemployment. Turns out they were wrong. Without a doubt, it does. In the 1940s, economists and politicians figured out, oh yeah, the money supply definitely affects the economy. And that point on, then they started to change what the purpose of the Federal Reserve was. Originally, it was just to bail out banks who were in trouble. But then later on, they figured out it controls the economy too. Then when the Fed was given the mandate to keep the economy at full employment, if they can. Before Keynes, economists felt that fiscal policy wouldn't do any good either. If you just spent, and the government starts spending money, well, there's just going to be less left over for other people to spend. if you tax people more money to spend, well, they would have less to spend. There's only so much to go around. If the government starts getting some of it, then there's going to be less left over for everybody else. So they essentially thought it wouldn't do any good. So in terms of Keynes's aggregate demand, where output is equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports, Keynes's thinking is stimulate or increase government spending and it'll increase output. The pre-Keynesian thinking was, well, if you increase government spending, something else is going to drop. Like consumption's going to have to drop, or investment spending is going to have to drop. It'll drop by the same amount. So therefore, government spending wouldn't do anything. Now, Keynes wasn't the only one who thought that, oh no, it would do something. It would stimulate the economy. But he was the only one that really put it into a nice theory, a model to explain just how it worked. Now, there still is some debate about fiscal policy and how much it works. There's a lot of drawbacks to it. One, the politicians have to get together and think about it and do it. There's a lot of lag time between they can figure out where to spend the money and the money actually gets into the economy. There's still some debate about how effective it is, because it just might reduce some investment spending and some consumption spending. Now, you would think after 70 years, this would have all been figured out by now. We'd know if it works and how well it works. Not really. What we can say is it seems to work most of the time, although there might be times when it doesn't work. Japan tried to stimulate their economy a long time with fiscal policy, and it doesn't seem to do any good. After the Korean War, there was a big drop in government spending, and it created a recession. So, and without a doubt, it was the drop in government spending that caused that recession right after the Korean War. Okay, so does fiscal policy work? There seems to be something to it. It's not all smoke and mirrors. It does have some components of it working. The question is, how much does it work? How does it work 100% of the time? What times does it not work? It would be nice to know what times it doesn't work and doesn't do any good, how much of an effect that it has. If the government starts spending $1 million in G, how much does GDP go up? Right now, it seems like it's about 1 for 1. So if the government spends $1 million, real GDP goes up by about $1 million. If the economy goes into a recession and GDP drops by 2 trillion, then that would imply the government has to start spending 2 trillion. Or a combination of government spending and lowering taxes by 2 trillion to get aggregate demand back to where it was. It'd be nice to know just exactly how effective it is before it's used. So, but anyway, it's like, well, there's a recession. What do we do? Can't hurt to try. This latest recession, what they've done is not just go out and start spending money, but actually on bridges and things like that. Keynes said it doesn't matter what you spend it on, just spend it. Now they're getting a little better at spending the money in fiscal policy. They're just trying to give it to certain people that need it and get them spending and put it in the hands of people like stimulus checks. So the people can, instead of the government spending the money, people can go out and start spending the money. The only drawback with that is sometimes people don't go out and spend the money. They save some of it. If they save it, then it doesn't have the effect on aggregate demand that economists would like to have by just going out and having the government spend the money.